Sometimes life comes down to a single moment of kindness in the pouring rain. Cal Monroe was drowning, not in the floodwaters washing across Highway 9 that October night, but in medical bills, eviction notices, and the weight of raising his 8-year-old son alone. When he spotted the woman in scrubs kneeling beside her broken-down Honda, soaked to the bone and struggling with a tire iron, he didn't hesitate. His own battered pickup was running on fumes, his last $20 tucked away for Micah's school. Lunch money, but Cal pulled over anyway. That's just who he was. What he didn't know was that Jenna Halley wasn't just any nurse. She was about to receive a phone call that would change both their lives forever. A call about a pilot program, a nomination, and a second chance neither of them saw coming. But would their growing feelings destroy the very opportunity that brought them together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of the cramped apartment at exactly 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Cal Monroe had intended to wake up. He'd learned to rise before the sound could disturb Micah, whose small form lay curled beneath a patchwork quilt in the corner bed they shared. The boy's breathing came soft and steady, his dark hair falling across features that mirrored his late mother's gentle beauty, the same wide eyes, the same thoughtful expression that seemed to carry wisdom beyond his 8 years. Cal's bare feet touched the cold linoleum floor as he moved with practiced silence toward the kitchenette. The apartment was generous in calling itself a one-bedroom. It was more accurately described as a studio with delusions of grandeur. 32 years old, and this was what his life had been reduced to. A space barely larger than the tool shed he'd once used for storing equipment back when Monroe construction had been more than just a faded business card in his wallet. He ran water into the coffee maker, counting out spoonfuls of generic grounds with the precision of a man who knew exactly how long each canister needed to last. Through the single window, dawn was beginning to creep across the parking lot of the Meadowbrook apartments, illuminating a landscape of cracked asphalt and rusted cars that told stories of other people's struggles. His own truck, or rather, what had been his truck until the repo man claimed it last month, was conspicuously absent from its usual spot. The coffee began its familiar percolating song, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Cal's morning ritual of quiet desperation. He pulled a manila folder from beneath a stack of bills on the counter, spreading its contents across the small table. Job applications, all of them. Henderson's Hardware had called yesterday, not to offer him work, but to inform him they'd selected someone else for the assistant manager position. The disappointment had settled into his chest like a physical weight, joining the collection of rejections that seemed to multiply with each passing week. Sarah's photograph smiled at him. From the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a paintbrush, one of Micah's choices from their last visit to the dollar store. In the picture, she was holding newborn Micah, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that Cal sometimes struggled to remember feeling himself. 3 years had passed since the accident, since the drunk driver had decided that red lights were merely suggestions, but grief had a way of making time irrelevant. Some mornings, Cal woke expecting to hear her humming in the shower, to smell her vanilla perfume lingering in the air. The medical bills from her final weeks were stacked neatly in a shoebox beside the refrigerator, $847,000 worth of hope that had ultimately proven insufficient. Even with insurance, their portion had been staggering. The house had gone first, then the business equipment, then the truck. Cal had sold everything that wasn't nailed down and a few things that were, but the debt followed them like a shadow, growing larger with each month's interest charges. Micah stirred in the bed, making soft sounds that indicated the approach of consciousness. Cal smiled despite himself. His son had always been a gradual waker, surfacing from sleep in layers like a deep-sea diver, ascending slowly to avoid the bends. It was one of those small details that made parenthood simultaneously wonderful and heartbreaking. Knowing someone so completely while feeling utterly inadequate to provide for them. "Morning, buddy," Cal whispered as Micah's eyes fluttered open. The boy's first instinct was always to look around for Cal, a habit that had developed in the chaotic months following Sarah's death. Only when he located his father did his small body relax. "Is it a school day?" Micah asked, his voice carrying that particular roughness of childhood mornings. "It is, indeed. But we've got time for breakfast and maybe a few minutes with your sketchbook if you'd like." Micah's face brightened at the mention of his most prized possession. The sketchbook had been a gift from his art teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd noticed his talent and quietly supplemented his supplies when Cal couldn't afford them. Its pages were filled with drawings that revealed a depth of observation that continually amazed Cal. Detailed renderings of their neighborhood, portraits of people they'd encountered, and, most frequently, memories of Sarah that Micah captured with an emotional honesty that took Cal's breath away. The boy had drawn his mother reading bedtime stories, braiding his hair, teaching him to tie his shoes. Each image was a window into how Micah processed their loss, transforming grief into something beautiful and permanent. Cal had initially worried about his son's tendency to retreat into art, but their pediatrician, one of the few doctors who'd been willing to work with their payment plan, had assured him that creative expression was a healthy coping mechanism. "Can I draw the lady from last night?" Micah asked as he padded toward the bathroom. "The one with the flat tire?" Cal paused in the middle of preparing their breakfast, 2 pieces of toast split between them, with peanut butter carefully rationed to make the jar last another week. "What do you remember about her?" "She seemed sad, but not the same kind of sad as you get sometimes. More like tired sad. And she had kind eyes. I want to draw her eyes." The boy's perceptiveness never ceased to amaze Cal. Micah had inherited Sarah's ability to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize the emotional undercurrents that most people missed or chose to ignore. It was a gift that would serve him well in life, though Cal worried about how much responsibility that level of awareness placed on such small shoulders. "That sounds like a fine idea," Cal said, though the memory of the previous night's encounter brought with it a complex mix of emotions. The woman, Jenna, she'd said her name was, had thanked him with a sincerity that suggested she understood the sacrifice his help represented. Most people wouldn't have recognized that stopping to assist a stranger meant arriving home even later, meant less time for the job searching that consumed his evenings, meant using gas money he couldn't spare. But Cal had been raised by a father who believed that character was revealed not in grand gestures, but in small moments when no one was watching. Ed Monroe had been a man of few words but consistent actions, someone who taught his son that helping others wasn't contingent on your own circumstances. "You don't have to be rich to be decent," he'd often said. "Sometimes being decent is what helps you become rich in the ways that matter." As Micah emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in the same jeans he'd worn yesterday, they had 3 pairs that fit him, and Cal rotated them carefully to maintain the illusion of variety. Cal felt the familiar twist of inadequacy in his stomach. His son deserved better than hand-me-down clothes and breakfast that consisted of toast scraps. He deserved a father who could provide stability, who could afford art supplies and soccer shoes and the 1,000 small things that made childhood magical. "Dad?" Micah's voice carried a note of concern. "You're doing that thing with your face. Again. What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're trying to solve a really hard math problem, except the math problem is inside your head and it's making you sad." Cal knelt down to Micah's level, placing his hands on his son's narrow shoulders. "I'm not sad, buddy. I'm just thinking about how to make things better for us." "Things aren't so bad," Micah said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "We have each other and we have a place to sleep, and Mrs. Rodriguez says my drawings are getting really good. That's more than some people have." The simple truth of his son's observation hit Cal with unexpected force. Micah was right, of course. They had shelter, they had food, modest though it might be, and they had each other. In focusing so intently on what they lacked, Cal had perhaps lost sight of what they still possessed. It was a perspective that his 8-year-old son seemed to grasp more clearly than he did. They ate their breakfast in companionable silence, Micah sketching between bites while Cal reviewed the day's plan. Drop Micah at school, walk to the library, to use their computers for job searching, pick up groceries with their remaining food stamps, collect Micah, help with homework, prepare dinner, and repeat. It was a routine born of necessity, but it was their routine, and there was comfort in its predictability. As they prepared to leave for school, Cal caught sight of their reflection in the apartment's single mirror. Father and son, both thin from careful meal planning, both wearing clothes that had seen better days, but both standing straight with dignity and tact. Micah's backpack was patched with duct tape, but his homework was complete. Cal's shoes were resoled with cardboard, but they were clean and polished. "We're doing okay, aren't we, Dad?" Micah asked as they stepped out into the crisp morning air. Cal looked down at his son, this remarkable little person who faced each day with optimism despite circumstances that would crush many adults, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the disappearance of their problems, but a renewed recognition of their resilience. "We're doing more than okay, Micah. We're doing what we need to do, and we're doing it together." As they walked toward the school, Cal found himself thinking again about the woman from the previous night. There had been something in her expression, a recognition of shared struggle that transcended their brief interaction. He wondered if she, too, knew what it meant to keep moving forward when the path ahead seemed uncertain, to find strength in small kindnesses, both given and received. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces as they walked. Whatever challenges the day might bring, they would meet them as they always did, together with dignity and with the quiet determination that had carried them this far. It would have to be enough, because it was all they had. And sometimes all you had was enough to change everything. The interview at Caldwell & Sons Construction had gone poorly from the moment Cal walked through their glass doors. His carefully pressed shirt, the only one without visible wear, couldn't disguise the fact that his work boots had been resoled twice, or that he'd arrived on foot rather than in the company truck that would have marked him as an established contractor. The hiring manager, a man barely older than Cal, but with the soft hands of someone who'd inherited rather than earned his position, had barely glanced at his portfolio before delivering the familiar refrain. "We're looking for someone with more recent experience," he'd said, though Cal's resume clearly showed 15 years of successful project management before Sarah's illness had derailed everything. "Maybe something will open up in the spring." The polite dismissal stung more than outright rejection would have. At least harsh honesty acknowledged his humanity. This gentle condescension treated him like a problem to be managed rather than a person seeking work. Cal had thanked the man professionally, shaken his hand, and walked back into the October afternoon with his dignity intact, but his hope fractured a little more. By the time he picked up Micah from school, the clouds had gathered into something ominous. The weather app on his ancient flip phone, a necessity he maintained despite the monthly expense, warned of severe thunderstorms approaching from the west. Micah climbed into the borrowed car with his usual quiet observation, sensing his father's mood without needing explanation. "No luck today?" Micah asked as they pulled away from Lincoln Elementary. "Not today, buddy, but tomorrow's another chance." The borrowed vehicle was a kindness from Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor who'd broken her hip and couldn't drive. It's an exchange for occasional grocery runs and small repairs around her apartment. She let Cal use her ancient Honda Civic when absolutely necessary. He was careful not to abuse the privilege, using it only for job interviews and emergencies, but today qualified as both. The first fat raindrops splattered against the windshield as they turned onto Highway 9, the main route that connected their apartment complex to the rest of the county. Within minutes, the drizzle intensified into a steady downpour, then transformed into something approaching a deluge. The old Honda's wipers struggled against the torrent, creating brief moments of clarity, followed by sheets of water that made the road ahead nearly invisible. "Maybe we should pull over," Micah suggested, his voice carrying the careful concern of a child who'd learned not to add to his father's burdens, but couldn't completely suppress his anxiety. Cal was considering exactly that when his headlights caught something unusual ahead. A car, a newer Honda Accord, sat partially on the shoulder, with its hazard lights blinking like a distress beacon. As they drew closer, Cal could make out a figure kneeling beside the rear tire, struggling with what appeared to be a jack or tire iron. His first instinct was to keep driving. They were already running low on gas, and Mrs. Chen's car wasn't equipped for roadside emergencies. The practical voice in his head catalogued all the reasons to pass by. The storm was worsening, Micah was in the car, they had no cell phone coverage in this stretch of rural highway, and frankly, Cal had enough problems of his own without taking on someone else's. But as they approached, he caught sight of the person more clearly through the rain-streaked windshield. A woman in medical scrubs, soaked through and struggling with equipment that was clearly beyond her mechanical experience. Her posture spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, the kind of bone-deep weariness that Cal recognized in his own mirror each morning. "Dad, is that the lady from the hospital?" Micah asked, pressing his face against the passenger window. "I don't know, son. Could be. But something about her triggered a memory of his father's voice. You don't have to be rich to be decent, Ed." Monroe had never met a stranger in distress he wouldn't help, despite their own family's modest circumstances. It was a lesson taught more through example than words, and one that Cal realized he'd been in danger of forgetting under the weight of his own struggles. "We should help her," Micah said simply, as if the decision was obvious. Cal checked his mirrors, slowed the Honda and pulled onto the shoulder behind the stranded vehicle. The woman looked up as his headlights illuminated her predicament, a flat tire and a jack that appeared to be either broken or beyond her expertise. Even through the rain and limited visibility, he could see the relief that crossed her features. When she realized someone had stopped, "Stay in the car, buddy," Cal told Micah as he prepared to step into the storm. "Keep the doors locked and the engine running." "Be careful, Dad." The rain hit him like a physical blow the moment he left the car's protection. Within seconds, his carefully pressed shirt was plastered to his skin, and water was running in rivulets down his face. He approached the woman, with his hands visible, understanding that a stranger emerging from the darkness during a storm might reasonably cause alarm. "Need some help?" he called over the sound of rain hammering against metal. "Oh, thank God," she replied, pushing wet hair away from her face. "I think the jack is broken or I'm using it wrong. I've been at this for 20 minutes, up close." Cal could see that she was indeed wearing medical scrubs beneath a light jacket that had provided no protection against the deluge. Her hospital ID badge hung from a lanyard around her neck, though the rain had rendered the text illegible. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that spoke of long shifts and difficult decisions. "Let me take a look," Cal said, kneeling beside the flat tire. The problem was immediately apparent. She'd positioned the jack incorrectly, placing it on a section of the frame that couldn't support the vehicle's weight. It was an honest mistake for someone unfamiliar with automotive repair, but one that could have been dangerous if she'd managed to raise the car. "The jack's fine," he said, repositioning it properly. "Just needed to be in the right spot. Here, let me get you sorted out." He worked efficiently despite the rain, drawing on muscle memory from years of roadside repairs during his contracting days. The spare tire was in decent condition, and within 15 minutes he had the flat removed and the replacement mounted. His hands were numb with cold by the time he lowered the car back to the ground, but the work felt good. the satisfaction of solving a problem with practical skills rather than words on a resume. "I can't thank you enough," the woman said as he tightened the last lug nut. "I'm Jenna, by the way, Jenna Halley." "Cal Monroe," he replied, standing and wiping his hands on his already soaked jeans. "Glad I could help. Are you sure I can't pay you something? Gas money or—" "No need," Cal interrupted gently. "Just pay it forward when you get the chance." Jenna studied his face for a moment, and Cal had the strange sensation that she was seeing more than most people bothered to look for. There was intelligence in her eyes, but also compassion, the kind of professional empathy that came from years of caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She fumbled in her purse, eventually producing a business card that she pressed into his hand. "Well, if you ever need anything, medical questions, whatever, please don't hesitate to call. I work in the ER at County General." Cal accepted the card, though he couldn't imagine circumstances under which he'd use it. Emergency room visits were luxuries his family couldn't afford, and medical questions were resolved through internet research and hope rather than professional consultation. "Thank you," he said simply. As they parted ways, Jenna heading north toward town, Cal and Micah continuing south toward their apartment, Cal felt an unexpected lightness despite his soaked clothing and the evening's earlier disappointment. There was something restorative about being able to help someone, about being useful in a concrete way that his morning's job interview had failed to provide. "That was nice of you, Dad," Micah said as they drove through the continuing storm. "It was the right thing to do. Mom would have liked her," Micah observed, with the casual certainty that sometimes characterized his pronouncements about Sarah's potential opinions. Cal glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, surprised by the comment. "What makes you say that?" She had sad eyes, but not angry sad, just tired sad, like she cares about people so much that it makes her tired. Mom was like that sometimes, especially when she was helping at the shelter. The accuracy of Micah's observation caught Cal off guard. Sarah had indeed volunteered at the homeless shelter downtown, coming home emotionally drained, but somehow fulfilled by the work. She'd had exactly that quality Micah described, compassion, that was both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. Meanwhile, 30 miles north, Jenna Halley sat in her car in the parking garage of County General Hospital, staring at her. A phone with growing excitement. The call had come through just as she'd reached the safety of covered parking, and the timing felt like more than coincidence. "Jenna, it's Dr. Martinez," her supervisor had said without preamble. "I know you just finished a double shift, but I needed to catch you before you left. The hospital board just approved the Family-Centered Healthcare Initiative pilot program. We need to identify candidates for the initial case studies immediately. Families that would benefit from comprehensive support services." Dr. Martinez had gone on to explain the program's scope: temporary housing assistance, job training coordination, healthcare navigation, and family counseling services, all designed to address the social determinants that often prevented successful medical outcomes. It was exactly the kind of holistic approach Jenna had advocated for during her graduate studies, and she'd been instrumental in developing the proposal. "We need our first family identified by Monday," Dr. Martinez had continued. "Someone who exemplifies the target demographic, working poor, medical debt, housing instability, but with genuine potential for positive outcomes given the right support structure." As Jenna ended the call, her mind immediately returned to the man who'd stopped to help her in the storm, Cal Monroe. There had been something about him. The careful way he'd spoken, the quality of his work despite clearly limited resources, the quiet dignity that poverty hadn't managed to erode, and the child in the car, watching with solemn eyes that suggested wisdom beyond his years. She pulled Cal's image back into focus, the resoled work boots, the carefully maintained appearance. Despite obvious financial strain, the professional competence he'd displayed in changing her tire. Most tellingly, he'd refused payment while clearly needing it, suggesting both pride and principles that would make him an ideal candidate for the program's empowerment-focused approach. But as she sat in her car, still processing the remarkable timing of the evening's events, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a concern. The program had strict ethical guidelines about patient recruitment and potential conflicts of interest. Would her personal interaction with Cal compromise her ability to nominate him? Should she disclose their encounter to Dr. Martinez? The rain continued to pound against her windshield as Jenna weighed her options. The program could genuinely transform Cal's family's circumstances. She was certain of that. But it could also raise questions about the propriety of her involvement if anyone discovered their prior connection. As she finally started her car and pulled out of the parking garage, Jenna made a decision that would prove to have consequences none of them could foresee. She would nominate Cal Monroe for the pilot program, and she would keep their roadside encounter to herself. After all, what harm could come from a simple act of kindness meeting an extraordinary opportunity? The storm was beginning to subside as she drove home, but neither Cal nor Jenna could have predicted that the most turbulent weather was still ahead of them. The manila folder felt heavier than its contents should have warranted as Jenna carried it through the administrative corridors of County General Hospital. Inside were 12 carefully compiled case studies, potential candidates for the family-centered healthcare initiative that represented 2 years of planning and proposal writing. Each folder contained a story of struggle, but also potential. Families who could benefit from the kind of comprehensive support that traditional healthcare rarely provided. Dr. Elena Martinez's office occupied a corner of the hospital's administrative wing, its windows offering a view of the city that stretched beyond the medical campus. At 55, Dr. Martinez carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades navigating both patient care and hospital politics. She had been Jenna's mentor since graduate school, guiding her through the complex intersection of social work and medical care that defined their shared passion. "Jenna, thank you for staying late," Dr. Martinez said as Jenna knocked on her open door. "I know you've been pulling doubles all week, but the timing on this program approval couldn't be better. The board is looking for immediate implementation." Jenna settled into the chair across from Dr. Martinez's desk, placing the folder carefully between them. "I've identified several strong candidates, families that would really benefit from the wraparound services we're proposing. Walk me through your top choices." Jenna opened the folder, revealing individual case summaries she'd compiled from emergency department encounters, social service referrals, and community outreach contacts. Each represented hours of research and careful evaluation, but her attention kept returning to one particular summary, the one she'd written about Cal Monroe. "The Henderson family has 3 children under 10, frequent ER visits for asthma complications, housing instability due to job loss," she began, reading from the first case study. "Strong family unit, but overwhelmed by the complexity of managing chronic care while dealing with unemployment." Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes as Jenna continued through the cases. "The Rodriguez family, dealing with elderly grandparents' diabetes management while both parents worked multiple jobs. The Thompson family, where a construction accident had left the father partially disabled and struggling with both physical rehabilitation and financial recovery. These are all strong candidates," Dr. Martinez observed. "Complex situations that would benefit from coordinated intervention. What's your recommendation for our initial case study?" Jenna hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over Cal's file. "The Monroe family presents an interesting combination of challenges and assets. Single father, 8-year-old son, significant medical debt from his wife's terminal illness 3 years ago. He's experienced in construction, but hasn't been able to find stable work since her death. Medical debt? Substantial, close to $1 million in total charges, even with insurance coverage. They've lost their home, his business, and they're currently in temporary housing that's becoming untenable." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "What makes them a good fit for the program?" The father has strong work skills and experience. He was a successful contractor before the crisis. The child is bright, doing well in school despite the instability, and shows remarkable resilience. Most importantly, they've maintained their family stability and dignity despite circumstances that would break many families apart. Jenna found herself speaking with more passion than she'd intended, drawing on observations that went beyond the clinical data in Cal's file. She caught herself before revealing details that couldn't have come from official sources, but Dr. Martinez seemed too focused on the case particulars to notice any inconsistency. How did they come to your attention? Emergency department encounter, Jenna said, which was technically true. Brief interaction, but enough to assess their situation and potential for positive outcomes. Dr. Martinez studied the summary Jenna had prepared, her experienced eye evaluating the combination of need and opportunity that Cal's case represented. The metrics looked strong. Demonstrated work history, stable family structure, specific skill set that aligns with local employment opportunities. How recent was your contact with them? Very recent, Jenna replied, hoping her tone remained professional despite the increasing complexity of the conversation. Excellent. The board wants to see immediate engagement with our first case study. Family, can you reach out this week? Of course. Dr. Martinez closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Jenna, I want you to understand the importance of this pilot program. We've fought for 2 years to get approval for this kind of comprehensive approach. The board is watching closely, and our success with these initial families will determine whether we can expand the program hospital-wide. I understand. The families we select need to be perfect candidates, challenging enough to demonstrate the program's necessity, but stable enough to show positive outcomes. We can't afford any complications or ethical concerns that might undermine our credibility. Jenna felt a flutter of anxiety at Dr. Martinez's emphasis on ethical concerns, but she maintained her composure. The families I've identified all meet those criteria. Good. I'll submit the Monroe case to the board for approval as our primary case study. If they give us the green light, I want you to make contact within 48 hours. We'll need to move quickly to show momentum. As Jenna gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez added a final observation that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. One more thing, Jenna. Given the visibility of this program, we'll need to maintain absolute transparency in our patient interactions. The board has emphasized that any conflicts of interest or undisclosed relationships could jeopardize not just the program, but our department's credibility. Standard protocol will include documentation of how families were identified and recruited. Of course, Jenna managed, though her mouth had gone dry. I'm sure that won't be an issue. Your professionalism has always been exemplary. Walking back through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, Jenna felt the weight of her decision settling around her like a physical presence. She had just committed to a course of action that, while potentially life-changing for Cal and Micah, also carried risks she was only beginning to fully understand. The hospital's ethics protocols existed for good reason. Patient recruitment required careful documentation precisely to avoid situations where personal relationships might compromise professional judgment or create conflicts of interest. By not disclosing her roadside encounter with Cal, she was already operating in a gray area that could become genuinely problematic if discovered. But as she reached her car and sat in the quiet darkness of the parking garage, Jenna found herself thinking about Cal's careful refusal of payment despite his obvious need, about Micah's solemn eyes watching from the back seat, about the dignity they'd maintained despite circumstances that would have justified bitterness or despair. The program could genuinely transform their lives, providing not just temporary assistance, but the kind of comprehensive support that could break the cycle of poverty and instability they were trapped in. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Karen. How did the program meeting go? Are you going to be able to help some families? Jenna stared at the message for a long moment before typing her response. Better than expected. I think we're going to be able to make a real difference. As she drove home through streets still, wet from the previous night's storm, Jenna made a mental note to research Cal's background more thoroughly before making contact. She would need to be prepared for their conversation, armed with information that could have reasonably come from official sources rather than their brief roadside encounter. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to help Cal, she was potentially putting both of them at risk. But sometimes, she reflected, doing the right thing required accepting a certain amount of uncertainty about the consequences. Her nursing training had taught her that healing often involved calculated risks, and this situation felt like an extension of that principle. 2 days later, as Jenna prepared to make the phone call that would change everything, she reminded herself of the fundamental truth that had motivated her career choice. Sometimes the greatest healing came not from following protocols perfectly, but from recognizing when compassion required stepping beyond the comfortable boundaries of professional distance. The phone rang twice before Cal's voice answered, cautious and slightly weary in the way that suggested too many calls from creditors and bill collectors. Mr. Monroe, this is Jenna Halley from County General Hospital. I'm calling about an opportunity that might be of interest to your family. The keys felt impossibly light in Cal's palm as he stood before the door of apartment 2B in the Riverside Gardens complex. After years of carrying the weight of unpaid bills and uncertain tomorrows, holding something as simple as a set of house keys seemed almost surreal. The silver metal caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the hallway windows, each key representing a different aspect of the stability he'd thought lost forever. "Are you sure this is ours, Dad?" Micah whispered, his voice carrying the same disbelief that Cal felt churning in his chest. "According to Ms. Halley, it is," Cal replied, though he still struggled to process the events of the past week. The phone call had come out of nowhere, an invitation to participate in something called the Family-Centered Healthcare Initiative, a pilot program that offered temporary housing, job training support, and what Jenna had described as wraparound services designed to address the social factors that often prevented successful medical outcomes. Cal had been suspicious initially, his experience with too good to be true offers having taught him caution. But the hospital's credentials were legitimate, the paperwork was official, and most importantly, the program asked for nothing up front except his willingness to participate in regular check-ins and evaluations. Even his pride, that stubborn barrier that had prevented him from accepting charity in the past, could accommodate the program's language of mutual benefit and case study participation. The apartment was modest but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air. Compared to their previous cramped studio, it felt palatial. Micah moved through the space with the careful reverence of someone who'd learned not to get too attached to good things, but Cal could see the excitement building behind his son's composed exterior. "I have my own room?" Micah asked, standing in the doorway of the smaller bedroom. "You have your own room," Cal confirmed, feeling something ease in his chest that had been tight for so long he'd forgotten what relaxation felt like. They spent the first hour simply walking through the space, opening cabinets and closets, testing light switches and faucets with the thoroughness of people who'd lived too long with broken things. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, already stocked with basic groceries courtesy of the program. Fresh milk, bread, eggs, fruits and vegetables that Cal hadn't been able to afford in months, each item a small miracle of abundance. "Dad, look at this," Micah called from his new bedroom. He was standing at the window, which looked out over a small playground where other children were playing. The sound of their laughter drifted up through the glass, a soundtrack of normalcy that Micah had been missing for too long. "Nice view," Cal said, joining his son at the window. Below, he could see families enjoying the early evening, parents pushing children on swings, Kids chasing each other around playground equipment, the kind of casual interactions that poverty often made impossible. That night, as they prepared for bed in their respective rooms, Cal found himself overwhelmed by the simple luxury of privacy. Micah had spent an hour arranging his art supplies on the small desk by his window, organizing colored pencils and sketch pads with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to treasure creative tools. For the first time in years, he didn't have to whisper to avoid disturbing his father, and Cal didn't have to monitor his son's sleep patterns from 3 feet away. The next morning brought Cal's first appointment at the program's job training facility, located in a converted warehouse on the south side of town. He arrived early, still adjusting to the luxury of reliable transportation. The program had provided a monthly bus pass along with their housing assistance, and found himself face-to-face with Maria Santos, the program's employment coordinator. "Mr. Monroe," she said, greeting him with a handshake that spoke of someone accustomed to working with people who'd lost confidence in their professional abilities. "I've reviewed your work history. 15 years in construction, project management, experience, your own business before. The difficulties, that's an impressive background." Cal nodded, unsure how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had referred to his work history as impressive that he'd almost forgotten he possessed valuable skills. The past 3 years of rejections and dismissals had gradually eroded his sense of professional competence, leaving him feeling more like a supplicant than a skilled tradesman seeking employment. "We've arranged for you to work with Thompson and Associates Construction," Maria continued, sliding a folder across the desk toward him. "They're a mid-size firm that's been growing steadily, and they're interested in experienced project managers who understand both the technical and business sides of construction. They know about my situation. They know you're participating in our program, which tells them you're someone we believe has strong potential for success. That's actually a positive recommendation in their eyes. They've worked with us before. The assessment process was thorough, but encouraging. Cal found himself demonstrating skills he'd thought atrophied by disuse, reading blueprints, calculating material requirements, discussing project timelines and budget management. The facility had mock construction scenarios set up, and for the first time in years, Cal felt the satisfaction of competent work flowing from his hands and mind. "Your technical skills are solid," observed Jim Thompson, the company's senior partner, after Cal had completed a project estimation exercise. "What I'm really looking for is reliability and communication. Can you work with clients who sometimes change their minds mid-project? Can you manage subcontractors who don't always share your work ethic?" "I've been doing exactly that for 15 years, Cal replied, then caught himself. I did that for 15 years. Before what?" Cal hesitated, then decided, "On honesty. Before my wife got sick and died, and I lost everything trying to pay for her treatment." Jim Thompson studied Cal's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was. But it doesn't change what I know about construction or my ability to do good work." "No, I don't imagine it would." Thompson made some notes on Cal's evaluation form. "We'll start you in an assistant project manager role with the understanding that advancement is possible based on performance. The pay is modest to start, but there's health insurance after 90 days, and we contribute to a retirement plan." Cal felt something shift inside his chest, not just relief, but the return of something he'd thought permanently lost: purpose. The sense that his skills and experience had value beyond his own survival. That evening, as he and Micah sat down to dinner in their own kitchen at their own table, Cal found himself struggling to process the rapid transformation of their circumstances. 3 days ago, they'd been facing eviction and eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. Tonight, they were discussing Micah's school day over pasta with actual sauce, in a home where they could speak at normal volume without disturbing neighbors inches away. "This feels too good to be real," Cal said, voicing the anxiety that had been building alongside his gratitude. Maybe it's just what real is supposed to feel like, Micah replied, with the casual wisdom that continued to amaze his father. Maybe the bad stuff was what wasn't real. Later that night, as Cal lay in his own bed for the first time in months, he found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led them here. The storm, the flat tire, his decision to stop and help a stranger. None of it had seemed significant at the time, just basic human decency in response to someone else's need. How could he have known that simple act would somehow circle back? To transform his own life, he thought about Jenna Halley, the program coordinator who had been so professional during their interactions at the hospital. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. Perhaps it was simply that she had the kind of compassionate competence he associated with healthcare workers, the ability to see people's struggles without judgment, to offer help without condescension. As sleep finally claimed him, Cal allowed himself to believe, for the first time in years, that tomorrow might genuinely be better than today. The keys to their new life lay on his nightstand, catching moonlight from the window, a tangible reminder that sometimes the universe conspired to reward simple kindness with extraordinary grace. In the morning, he would begin work with Thompson and Associates. Micah would continue at his new school, where his art teacher had already noticed his talent and recommended him for an after-school program. They would build a routine around stability instead of crisis, make plans that extended beyond mere survival. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their temporary home, Cal Monroe allowed himself the luxury of hope, fragile and precious as the keys that had unlocked their new beginning. The steel-toed work boots felt solid beneath Cal's feet as he walked across the Thompson and Associates job site, clipboard in hand and safety helmet reflecting the morning sun. 3 weeks into his position as assistant project manager, he was beginning to remember what it felt like to be competent, to have his opinions sought and his expertise valued. The boots themselves had been a gift from the program. Sturdy, well-made footwear that spoke of professional respect rather than charity. "Cal, what's your assessment on the electrical rough-in for the Martinez house?" Jim Thompson called out, as he approached the residential project that had become Cal's primary responsibility. Cal consulted his notes, feeling the familiar satisfaction of organized information and systematic progress. Rodriguez Electric finished the main panel yesterday, and they're about 60% complete with the room circuits. Inspector Murphy is scheduled for Friday morning, which should keep us on track for insulation to start Monday. Any concerns? Minor issue with the kitchen outlet spacing. The homeowner wants to add an island that wasn't in the original plans. I've got Rodriguez pricing the additional circuit work, and I'll have options for the client by this afternoon. Thompson nodded approvingly, and Cal felt a quiet pride that went beyond professional competence. For the first time in years, he was solving problems rather than being one, contributing to something larger than his own survival. The work itself was familiar, but the context was transformative. He was no longer desperately seeking employment, but actively engaged in meaningful work. The Monroe family's progress had become something of a showcase for the hospital's pilot program. Dr. Martinez had visited twice to document their situation, and Cal had participated in several interviews for program evaluation purposes. Each interaction felt like a step toward legitimacy, proof that the assistance they were receiving was investment rather than charity. "Mr. Monroe," a woman's voice interrupted his review of the day's schedule. "I'm sorry to bother you at work." Cal turned to find Jenna Halley approaching across the job site, her professional demeanor intact, but something in her expression suggesting this was more than a routine check-in. She wore dark slacks and a button-down shirt beneath her hospital AD badge, looking every inch the healthcare administrator rather than the storm-soaked woman he'd helped on Highway 9. "Ms. Halley," he said, removing his work gloves, "is everything all right with the program?" "Oh yes, everything's fine. Actually, your case has been one of our most successful examples. I was hoping we could schedule a longer follow-up interview." Perhaps this evening? Dr. Martinez is preparing a presentation for the hospital board, and your family's progress is a centerpiece of our success metrics. There was something in her tone that suggested more than professional interest, though Cal couldn't quite identify what he was detecting. Perhaps it was simply that, after weeks of interaction, they'd developed the kind of comfortable working relationship that made formal conversations feel slightly artificial. Of course, would 6 o'clock work? Micah should be home from his art program by then. Perfect. I'll bring the usual documentation and we can review how things have been progressing. As Jenna prepared to leave, she paused and looked back at him. Cal, Mr. Monroe, I hope you know how much the program values your participation. Not everyone adapts as quickly or as successfully as you have. We appreciate the opportunity more than I can express. I can see that. Your son is thriving too, from what I understand. His art teacher submitted some of his work for the hospital's pediatric wing display. Cal felt a familiar surge of pride at the mention of Micah's artistic progress. The stability provided by the program had allowed his son's natural talents to flourish in ways that constant worry about housing and food had previously prevented. Micah's sketchbook now contained drawings of their new neighborhood, portraits of his classmates, and increasingly complex architectural studies inspired by Cal's construction work. That evening, as Cal prepared for Jenna's visit, he found himself paying unusual attention to their apartment's appearance. Not that it wasn't always clean. Years of cramped living had taught them both to maintain order in limited space, but he felt a particular desire for everything to reflect well on their use of the program's assistance. Micah had spread his latest drawings across the kitchen table, organizing them with the careful attention he brought to all his creative projects. Among them was a detailed sketch of the job site where Cal worked, complete with accurate depictions of the construction equipment and architectural details that most 8-year-olds wouldn't notice. That's impressive work, Jenna said when she arrived and saw Micah's artistic display. You've really captured the complexity of the construction process. Dad explains things to me, Micah replied with characteristic directness. He says, understanding how things are built helps you appreciate why they're beautiful. Jenna's smile seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally polite. That's a wonderful way to think about it. As they settled into the formal interview process, Cal found himself studying Jenna's questions and responses with growing curiosity. Her knowledge of their situation was comprehensive, but it also seemed to extend beyond what official documentation would typically provide. She asked about Micah's adjustment to having his own room, with an insight that suggested understanding of their previous living circumstances, and her questions about Cal's work satisfaction went deeper than standard program evaluation would require. The employment component has exceeded our expectations, she said, reviewing her notes. Your supervisor's reports indicate not just competent performance, but genuine enthusiasm for the work. It feels good to be useful again, Cal replied honestly, to have skills that matter, problems I can solve. That sense of purpose is exactly what the program aims to restore. Too often, people experiencing economic hardship are treated as problems, to be managed rather than resources with untapped potential. There was passion in her voice that went beyond professional advocacy, and Cal found himself wondering about her own background, what had drawn her to this particular kind of work. Most healthcare administrators he'd encountered seemed more focused on efficiency metrics than individual transformation. Can I ask you something? He said, as she prepared to conclude the interview. Of course, this program, this opportunity, it came at exactly the right moment for us, almost like someone knew we needed help and knew how to provide it effectively. How does the hospital identify families for participation? Jenna's pause was brief but noticeable. We use various sources: emergency department encounters, social service referrals, community outreach contacts. The goal is to identify families Who would benefit most from comprehensive intervention? Emergency department encounters? Yes, often families in crisis situations come through the ER for various reasons, and we can assess their broader needs beyond the immediate medical concern. Cal nodded, though something about her explanation felt incomplete. Perhaps it was simply that the program's success seemed too good to be true, too perfectly matched to their specific circumstances. In his experience, bureaucratic solutions really aligned so precisely with individual needs. Well, however we came to your attention, we're grateful, he said finally. The gratitude is mutual, Mr. Monroe. Your family's progress validates everything we hoped this program could accomplish. After Jenna left, Cal found himself reflecting on the strange symmetry of their circumstances. 6 weeks ago, he'd been contemplating the real possibility of homelessness, wondering how to explain to Micah that their temporary apartment was becoming unaffordable. Tonight, he was planning for Micah's enrollment in advanced art classes and considering the possibility of saving money for the first time in years. Dad, Micah looked up from his sketchbook where he'd been working on a new drawing. Do you like Ms. Halley? She's been very helpful with the program. Why do you ask? You get a different expression when she's here. Not worried exactly, but interested. Like when you're figuring out a complicated construction problem. Cal considered his son's observation. There was indeed something about Jenna that captured his attention beyond her professional role. Perhaps it was her genuine investment in their success, or the way she seemed to see potential rather than problems when she looked at their situation. Or perhaps it was simply that after years of interactions defined by necessity and crisis, it was refreshing to speak with someone who treated him as a person of value rather than a case to be managed. She cares about her work, he said finally. That's something I respect. As they prepared for bed, Cal found himself looking forward to the next day's challenges at the construction site with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The work. Boots stood ready by the door, symbols of professional competence restored and dignity reclaimed. Tomorrow, he would solve problems, make progress, contribute something meaningful to the world beyond mere survival. But tonight, in the quiet of their stable home, he allowed himself to acknowledge that the program had given them something beyond housing and employment. It had returned to them the possibility of a future that extended beyond the next crisis, the next bill, the next worry about providing for his son. And somehow, Jenna Halley had become the human face of that possibility, the person who had looked at their circumstances and seen opportunity rather than desperation. The thin gold band caught the lamplight as Cal absently twisted it around his finger, a gesture that had become unconscious over the 3 years since Sarah's death. He sat at the kitchen table of their program-provided apartment, reviewing construction, blueprints for the next day's work. But his mind kept drifting to the conversation he'd had with Jenna earlier that evening. Their program meetings had evolved beyond formal check-ins into something more resembling genuine conversations. Tonight, after completing the required documentation about his job progress and Micah's school adjustment, they'd found themselves talking about subjects that had nothing to do with case management, her nursing background, his construction philosophy, shared observations about the resilience of families facing adversity. "Dad, you're doing the ring thing again," Micah observed from his spot on the living room floor, where he was working on a detailed drawing of the construction site. "What ring thing?" "The thing where you twist Mom's ring when you're thinking about something complicated." Cal looked down at his hand, surprised to discover his son was right. The habit had developed during Sarah's illness, when the weight of medical decisions and financial stress had made the simple presence of his wedding ring both comfort and reminder. Even after her death, he'd continued wearing it, not from inability to move forward, but from a desire to honor what they'd built together. "What makes you think I'm thinking about something complicated?" "You get the same expression you had when you were trying to figure out how to fix the heater in our old apartment, except this isn't about broken things. This is about..." Micah paused, searching for words with the careful consideration that characterized his approach to difficult concepts. This is about things that might be good, but you're not sure if you should want them to be good. The accuracy of his son's observation was both impressive and unsettling. 8-year-olds shouldn't possess such insight into adult emotional complexity, but Micah had been forced to develop unusual perceptiveness during their years of instability. He'd learned to read Cal's moods not from curiosity but from necessity, gauging their family's emotional weather to navigate his own responses. "Ms. Halley seems nice," Micah continued, his attention apparently focused on his drawing, but his words, "on carrying careful weight. She is nice. She's been very helpful with the program. That's not what I mean." Cal set down the blueprints and looked at his son more directly. "What do you mean?" "She looks at you the way Mom used to look at you when she thought you were being particularly smart about something. And you look at her the way you used to look at Mom when she was explaining why we should donate our extra winter coats to the shelter, even though we didn't have very much money ourselves." The comparison caught Cal completely off guard. In the past several weeks, as his interactions with Jenna had become more personal, he'd been careful not to examine his own feelings too closely. She was a healthcare professional, helping his family transition back to stability. Any attraction he might feel was inappropriate and potentially damaging to the program relationship they both valued. But Micah's observation forced him to acknowledge what he'd been avoiding. There was indeed something about Jenna that reminded him of Sarah's particular combination of competence and compassion. Not physical resemblance. Sarah had been shorter, with lighter hair and different facial features, but a similar quality of seeing potential in difficult situations, of responding to struggle with practical help rather than sympathy. "It's complicated, buddy," Cal said finally. "Because of the program?" "Partly because of the program, but also because—" He paused, unsure how to explain the complexity of adult relationships to someone who was still processing his mother's death. Moving forward after losing someone you love is complicated. It doesn't mean forgetting them or loving them less, but it can mean making room for new people and new experiences. Micah considered this with characteristic seriousness. "Mom told me once that love isn't like money. You don't run out of it by spending it. She said the more you love, the more you have to give." Cal felt something tighten in his chest at the memory of Sarah's words. She'd been discussing their decision to foster a neighbor's child temporarily during a family crisis, but the principle she'd articulated had broader applications than either of them had realized at the time. She was right about that. "So if you like Miss Halley, that doesn't mean you like Mom less." "No, it doesn't. And if Ms. Halley likes you, that's probably because you're the kind of person who helps strangers change flat tires in thunderstorms." Cal's hand froze in the middle of reaching for his coffee cup. "What did you say?" "That's what I drew," Micah said, holding up his sketchbook to reveal a detailed rendering that Cal hadn't seen him working on. "You helping Ms. Halley that night, when it was raining so hard. I remembered her face when she came to visit us the first time, and I realized she was the lady with the broken car." The drawing was remarkably accurate, capturing not just the physical details of that stormy evening, but somehow conveying the emotional significance of the encounter. Cal could see himself kneeling beside Jenna's car, rain-soaked and focused, on the mechanical problem, while she stood nearby with an expression of grateful relief. In the background, Micah had drawn his own face, watching from the car window, observant and thoughtful. "You knew it was her?" "I figured it out when she visited the second time. She has the same kind eyes, and she looked at our apartment the way someone looks at a place when they're remembering it from before, not seeing it for the first time." Cal studied his son's drawing, processing the implications of Micah's revelation. If Jenna had indeed recognized them from their roadside encounter, then her involvement in their program placement took on an entirely different meaning. The timing had seemed remarkably fortuitous, but if it hadn't been coincidence— "Dad, are you worried?" "I'm trying to understand something. About Miss Halley knowing us from before?" about what that might mean for the program, for our family. Micah set down his colored pencils and moved to sit beside Cal at the table, his small presence offering comfort in the way that children sometimes intuited adult needs without being asked. Maybe it means she helped us because she could help us, not because she was supposed to help us. Like you helped her because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone told you to. Cal considered his son's perspective, recognizing the simple logic that cut through his own anxious complications. If Jenna had used her position to help them because of their brief encounter, it suggested personal investment in their welfare rather than professional obligation. The ethical implications were complex, but the human motivation was straightforward. That night, after Micah had gone to bed, Cal found himself walking the small apartment and thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this point. The storm, the flat tire, his decision to stop despite his own pressing needs, none of it had seemed significant at the time. But if Micah was right, if Jenna had recognized them and chosen to help because of that encounter, then his simple act of roadside assistance had somehow multiplied into comprehensive transformation of their circumstances. The phone rang at nearly 10 o'clock, startling him from his contemplation. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Cal, it's Jenna. I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to speak with you about something important. Is everything all right with the program?" "The program is fine, but there's something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned weeks ago." Cal felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, though Micah's drawing had already prepared him for this conversation. "What is it?" "I think we should meet in person. Are you free tomorrow evening? There's a coffee shop on 5th Street called Rowan's. Would that work?" "Jenna, you're making me nervous." "I don't mean to, it's just there are some aspects of how your family came to be selected for the program that we need to discuss. Personal aspects that go beyond the official documentation." After ending the call, Cal sat in the quiet apartment and considered the implications of tomorrow's conversation. Whatever Jenna needed to tell him, it was significant enough to require privacy and careful explanation. His instincts suggested it would confirm Micah's observation about their prior connection, but the consequences of that revelation remained unclear. He touched Sarah's ring again, this time consciously, acknowledging the symbolic weight it carried. For 3 years, it had represented his commitment to her memory and his reluctance to fully engage with the possibility of moving forward. But tonight, faced with the prospect that someone had cared enough about his family's welfare to take professional risks on their behalf, he found himself wondering if continuing to wear it was honor or self-imposed limitation. The question would have to wait for tomorrow's conversation, when he would finally learn the full truth about how their second chance had really begun. The security footage was grainy and time-stamped, but the image was unmistakably clear. Cal Monroe, kneeling beside a Honda Accord in the hospital parking garage, helping a woman in scrubs change a flat tire. The timestamp read, October 15th, 8:47 p.m., exactly 2 days before Jenna Halley had submitted his family's case study for the pilot program. Dr. Elena Martinez sat in the hospital security office, studying the monitor with growing concern, while Chief of Security Tom Walsh explained how the footage had come to light. "Routine review of the parking garage cameras," Walsh said, his tone apologetically professional. "We've been having some vandalism issues, so we were checking recent footage. When we noticed this interaction, wouldn't have thought much of it, except the man looked familiar from the promotional materials you've been circulating about the pilot program." Dr. Martinez leaned closer to the screen, hoping to find some detail that would make the obvious. Conclusion less troubling, but there was no mistaking Cal's distinctive features or Jenna's hospital ID badge, clearly visible even in the security camera's limited resolution. "Can you confirm the date on this timestamp?" "October 15th, definitely. The system logs are automatically synchronized with the hospital's master clock." "And when was the Monroe family first contacted about the program?" Walsh consulted the file folder beside him. "According to the documentation you provided, October 17th. First phone contact with initial interview on October 19th. The implications were immediately clear and potentially devastating. Either Jenna had failed to disclose a significant prior relationship with a program participant, or she had actively recruited someone based on personal rather than professional criteria. Both scenarios violated the ethical protocols that governed patient care and program administration. "I'll need a copy of this footage," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm of concern building in her chest. "And I'll need to review all documentation related to the Monroe case selection process. Of course, do you want me to flag any other interactions between these individuals in the hospital cameras?" "Yes, please. And Tom, I need you to keep this information confidential until I've had a chance to investigate further." An hour later, Dr. Martinez sat in her office, reviewing every piece of documentation related to Cal Monroe's recruitment into the pilot program. Jenna's initial case summary was thorough and professionally written, describing their family situation with the kind of clinical detail that suggested comprehensive assessment. But nowhere in the paperwork was there any mention of prior contact or personal interaction. The case selection meeting notes, which Dr. Martinez had written herself, recorded Jenna's presentation of Cal's situation as an emergency department encounter that had provided insight into their family dynamics and potential for program success. If the security footage was accurate, that characterization was at best misleading and at worst deliberately deceptive. Dr. Martinez had mentored Jenna through graduate school and 3 years of professional practice. She knew her to be conscientious, ethical, and genuinely committed to patient welfare. The idea that she would manipulate program protocols for personal reasons seemed inconsistent with everything Dr. Martinez thought she knew about her protégé's character. But the evidence was difficult to interpret any other way. The knock on her office door interrupted her troubled contemplation. "Come in, Dr. Martinez. You wanted to see me?" Jenna's voice carried its usual professional confidence, but something in her expression suggested she sensed the seriousness of the summons. "Please, sit down. We need to discuss the Monroe case." Jenna settled into the chair across from Dr. Martinez's desk, her posture attentive but relaxed. "Is there a problem with their progress? Cal's supervisor reports have been excellent, and Micah's school adjustment has exceeded all expectations. The family's progress isn't the issue. The issue is how they came to be selected for the program." Dr. Martinez turned her computer monitor toward Jenna, revealing the security footage frozen at the moment Cal was tightening the lug nuts on her spare tire. She watched Jenna's face carefully, noting the brief flicker of recognition followed by a controlled stillness that confirmed her worst fears. "Can you explain this footage to me?" Jenna stared at the screen for a long moment, her professional composure visibly struggling against something that might have been relief or resignation. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "I helped a woman with a flat tire. On October 15th, her name was Jenna Halley, and she was having car trouble in the hospital parking garage during a thunderstorm. And 2 days later, you nominated this same man's family for our pilot program without disclosing your prior interaction." "With him, yes." The simple admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both women understood completely. Dr. Martinez had expected denials, explanations, attempts to minimize the significance of the encounter. Jenna's straightforward acknowledgement of the facts made the situation somehow more serious, not less. "Jenna, help me understand your reasoning. You know our protocols regarding patient recruitment and conflict of interest disclosure." "I do know the protocols." "Then why didn't you follow them?" Jenna was quiet for nearly a minute, her gaze moving between the security footage and Dr. Martinez's face. When she finally answered, her voice carried a complexity of emotion that went beyond professional concern. "Because I knew that if I disclosed our prior contact, Cal's family would likely be eliminated from consideration." Not because they weren't perfect candidates, they were exactly what the program was designed to help, but because the appearance of impropriety would outweigh the genuine need and potential for positive outcomes. That wasn't your decision to make. No, it wasn't, but I made it anyway because sometimes the bureaucratic protocols designed to prevent problems end up preventing solutions. Dr. Martinez felt a headache building behind her temples. The pilot program represented 2 years of planning, proposal writing, and political navigation within the hospital's complex administrative structure. Its success was crucial not just for the families it served, but for the broader acceptance of comprehensive social care as a legitimate healthcare intervention. Do you understand what this means for the program? I understand that my poor judgment has potentially compromised something important. It's more than poor judgment, Jenna. It's a violation of patient care ethics that could invalidate our entire pilot study. If the hospital board discovers that our most successful case study was recruited through undisclosed personal relationships, they'll question every aspect of our methodology. What about Cal and Micah? The question was asked quietly, but it carried emotional weight that made Dr. Martinez pause. In her focus on program integrity and administrative consequences, she'd momentarily lost sight of the human impact of their crisis. I don't know yet. That will depend on how we handle the situation moving forward. They've been thriving. Cal's found his professional confidence again. Micah's artistic talents are flourishing. They have stable housing for the first time in years. Whatever mistakes I've made, the program has been genuinely transformative for their family. That's not the point. Isn't it exactly the point? Isn't the point to help families move from crisis to stability? Cal and Micah have done exactly that. Dr. Martinez recognized the passion in Jenna's voice, the same advocacy that had made her such an effective social worker and program coordinator. But passion without ethical boundaries was dangerous, particularly in healthcare settings where vulnerable populations depended on professional integrity. The point is to help families while maintaining the ethical standards that protect both patients and caregivers. When we blur those boundaries, we risk harming the very people we're trying to help. How is Cal harmed by having stable housing and meaningful work? Cal is harmed if this situation becomes public and he's forced to leave the program under circumstances that suggest impropriety or fraud. Cal is harmed if other families are denied similar opportunities because our pilot program loses credibility. Cal is harmed if his success is seen as the result of favoritism rather than his own efforts and potential. Jenna's composure finally cracked, and Dr. Martinez could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. I never intended for any of that to happen. I believe you, but intentions don't always determine outcomes. What happens now? Dr. Martinez leaned back in her chair, considering options that all seemed problematic. I have to report this to the hospital board. There will be an investigation into program protocols and patient recruitment procedures. Your involvement with the program will be suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. And Cal's family? That decision will be made by the board, not by me. They could be removed from the program. They could be removed from the program. Jenna sat in silence for several minutes, apparently processing the full scope of consequences that her decision had set in motion. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I need to tell Cal what's happening before he hears it from someone else. You're not to have any contact with program participants during the investigation. He deserves to know that this isn't his fault, that his family's situation is at risk because of my choices, not his. Any contact with the Monroe family could be seen as an attempt to influence their testimony during the investigation. Elena, Dr. Martinez, please. Cal has spent 3 years believing that good things don't happen to people like him. The program has given him hope that his efforts and character still matter, that his family can have a stable future. If he's forced to leave without understanding why, it will confirm every fear he's carried about being unworthy of help or happiness. Dr. Martinez felt the weight of leadership in moments like these, when administrative necessity conflicted with human compassion. The right decision for program integrity might be devastating for individuals who had done nothing wrong except trust in the possibility of positive change. I'll give you 48 hours to explain the situation to the Monroe family before the board meets. After that, all contact must cease until the investigation is complete. Thank you. Jenna, I want you to understand something. I believe you acted from good intentions, but good intentions don't excuse ethical violations. Your career, your professional reputation, and your ability to help families in the future are all at risk because of the choices you've made. I understand. As Jenna gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez found herself struggling with conflicting emotions. The young woman sitting across from her had violated fundamental professional protocols, but she'd done so in service of a family genuinely in need. The security footage that had exposed their dilemma also showed a simple act of human kindness, being repaid with life-changing assistance. Sometimes, Dr. Martinez reflected, the most troubling ethical dilemmas arose not from clear violations of right and wrong, but from conflicts between different definitions of what constituted doing good. The storm that had brought Cal and Jenna together was nothing compared to the one that was about to engulf them both. The cardboard boxes sat empty on the kitchen floor, waiting to be filled with the fragments of a life that had briefly felt permanent. Cal stared at them with the hollow numbness that comes when hope collapses so completely that even anger seems pointless. 48 hours ago, he'd been planning Micah's enrollment in advanced art classes. Now he was calculating how many of their belongings would fit in Mrs. Chen's Honda Civic when they inevitably had to leave. Jenna's explanation had been thorough and honest, delivered with the kind of professional compassion that somehow made the devastating news even more difficult to process. She told him about the security footage, the ethics investigation, her suspension from the program, and the hospital board meeting that would determine their family's fate within the week. What she hadn't been able to tell him was why she'd risked everything to help them, though Cal thought he was beginning to understand that part himself. "We don't have to pack everything tonight," Micah said quietly from his seat at the kitchen table, where he was carefully organizing his art supplies with the methodical precision of someone trying to maintain control over at least one small aspect of their disrupted world. "I know, buddy, but it helps to be prepared." "Prepared for what exactly?" Cal paused in his half-hearted sorting of kitchen items, struck by the directness of his son's question. In truth, he wasn't sure what they were preparing for. Dr. Martinez had explained that the board would review their case and determine whether they could remain in the program despite the circumstances of their recruitment, but she'd offered no prediction about the likely outcome, prepared for the possibility that we might need to find somewhere else to live. Back to the old apartment. I don't know. Maybe. Micah was quiet for several minutes, his attention apparently focused on arranging colored pencils in order of color intensity. Cal recognized the activity as one of his son's coping mechanisms, the creation of order and beauty when external circumstances felt chaotic and ugly. "Dad, can I ask you something that might be complicated?" "Of course. Do you think Miss Halley did something wrong by helping us?" The question cut to the heart of Cal's own, confused feelings about their situation. Intellectually, he understood the ethical concerns that Dr. Martinez had outlined. Professional boundaries existed to protect vulnerable patients from exploitation and to ensure that institutional resources were distributed fairly rather than based on personal relationships. But emotionally, Jenna's choice to help them felt less like a violation than a recognition of shared humanity that transcended bureaucratic protocols. "I think she did something that was against the rules, but not necessarily wrong," Cal said finally. "What's the difference? Rules are created to prevent problems, but sometimes following rules can prevent solutions too. Ms. Halley broke the rules, but she broke them to help us when we really needed help. So she's in trouble for being kind. She's in trouble for not telling the truth about how she knew us when she recommended us for the program. Micah considered this with the careful logic that he brought to all complex problems. But if she had told the truth, we wouldn't have gotten into the program, and we'd still be living in the tiny apartment with the broken heater. That's probably right. So telling the truth would have prevented us from getting help, but not telling the truth got her in trouble for helping us. Cal felt a familiar surge of pride at his son's ability to identify the essential contradiction at the heart of their dilemma. 8-year-olds shouldn't have to grapple with ethical complexities that challenged experienced healthcare administrators. But Micah's forced early maturity had given him insights that many adults never developed. That's exactly the problem. Micah, sometimes there isn't a choice that makes everyone happy or keeps everyone safe. What do you think will happen at the meeting? I honestly don't know. The phone rang before Cal could elaborate, and he was surprised to see Jim Thompson's name on the caller ID. His supervisor rarely called outside of work hours, and Cal's first instinct was to worry about some construction site emergency that would require his immediate attention. "Cal, I hope I'm not interrupting your evening," Thompson said without preamble. "I heard through some hospital contacts that there might be some complications with your family's participation in the pilot program." Cal felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. If word about their situation was already circulating beyond the hospital's administrative offices, it suggested the kind of institutional attention that rarely ended favorably for families like his. "There are some issues being reviewed," he replied carefully. "I don't know the details, and frankly, they're none of my business. But I wanted you to know that whatever happens with the program, your job with Thompson and Associates isn't dependent on your participation in it. You've proven yourself as a valuable employee based on your own skills and work ethic." The unexpected reassurance caught Cal completely off guard. For weeks, he'd been so focused on the comprehensive support provided by the hospital program that he'd almost forgotten his employment existed independently of their housing and social services. "I appreciate that more than you know. I also wanted you to know that if housing becomes an issue for your family, we've got a small apartment above our equipment warehouse that we've been planning to renovate. It's not fancy, but it's clean and functional, and it could be available immediately if you need it." Cal felt something shift in his chest, not the complete relief that would solve all their problems, but the recognition that their support network extended beyond the institutional program that had brought them stability. Thompson's offer represented something more valuable than temporary housing. It represented acknowledgement that Cal had earned a place in a community that valued his contributions. That's incredibly generous. It's practical business sense. Good project managers are hard to find, and I don't want to lose you over housing. Complications that have nothing to do with your work performance. After ending the call, Cal found himself looking at their situation from a different perspective. The hospital program had been transformative, providing not just housing and job training, but a comprehensive approach to family stability that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. But their success within the program had also demonstrated their capacity for independence, their ability to thrive when given genuine opportunities rather than temporary assistance. "Who was that?" Micah asked, looking up from his art supplies. "Mr. Thompson from my work. He wanted to make sure we knew that my job wasn't connected to the hospital program." "Does that mean we don't have to move?" "It means we have options even. If we can't stay here." As if summoned by their conversation about alternatives, Cal's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos, the program's employment coordinator. "Heard about the situation. Want you to know that 3 other contractors have called, asking about your availability if circumstances change. Your reputation is solid, regardless of program status." The message was followed by another from Mrs. Rodriguez, Micah's former art teacher. "Micah's portfolio has been accepted for the youth exhibition at the community center. Opening reception next month. Hope you can attend, regardless of other circumstances. Cal showed the messages to Micah, who read them with the careful attention he brought to all written communication. It sounds like people think we're worth helping even when we're not in a special program. It sounds like we've built relationships that matter beyond the program that brought us together. That evening, as they continued the process of organizing their belongings for an uncertain future, Cal found himself reflecting on the nature of the transformation their family had experienced. The hospital program had provided the stability and resources that allowed them to demonstrate their potential, but the actual growth, his professional competence, Micah's artistic development, their renewed sense of hope, belonged to them, regardless of institutional support. The drawing that had started everything sat propped against the kitchen window, Micah's artistic interpretation of the stormy night when Cal had stopped to help a stranger with a flat tire. Looking at it now, Cal could see details he'd missed before. The careful attention his son had paid to their expressions, the way he'd captured not just the mechanical act of changing a tire, but the human connection that had formed between two people facing different kinds of storms. "Dad, I've been thinking about what happens at the meeting," Micah said as he prepared for bed. "What about it? Maybe we should go to the hospital board meeting. Maybe they need to see us. Not just read about us in papers, but see that we're real people who got help by someone who cared enough to take a chance." Cal considered his son's suggestion. Dr. Martinez had mentioned that the board would review their case, but she hadn't indicated whether Cal's input would be welcome or appropriate. From an administrative perspective, their situation was probably better evaluated through documentation rather than emotional appeals. But from a human perspective, Micah's instinct felt right. The people making decisions about their families' future were discussing abstract concepts of ethical violations and program integrity. Perhaps they needed to understand the concrete impact of those decisions on the individuals involved. "You think we should tell them our side of the story?" "I think we should tell them what Ms. Halley's kindness meant to us, and what it would mean if they decided kindness was more important than following rules perfectly." As Cal tucked his son into bed, he found himself marveling at the wisdom that seemed to emerge from Micah's combination of artistic sensitivity and hard-earned maturity. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Martinez and request permission to address the board, not to beg for special consideration, but to ensure that their family's perspective was part of whatever decision ultimately determined their fate. The boxes could wait another day. Tonight, they would focus on preparing not for departure, but for the opportunity to advocate for the kind of compassionate pragmatism that had already changed their lives once. In the morning, they would face the storm together, as they always had. The hospital boardroom carried the sterile formality of institutional decision-making, with its polished conference table, high-backed leather chairs, and walls lined with certificates and commendations that spoke of decades of medical excellence. Cal sat in the designated area for public comment, his hands folded carefully in his lap, while Micah beside him clutched a folder containing printouts of program success statistics that they'd requested from Dr. Martinez's office. The 7 board members arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the board chair, was a woman in her 60s whose silver hair and measured demeanor suggested years of navigating complex healthcare politics. She called the meeting to order with the kind of professional courtesy that managed to be both welcoming and intimidating. "We're here today to review the circumstances surrounding the Family-Centered Healthcare Initiative pilot program, specifically regarding potential ethical violations in patient recruitment procedures," Dr. Hendricks began, consulting the agenda. Before her, "Dr. Martinez, please present your findings." Dr. Elena Martinez rose from her seat, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone whose professional reputation hung in the balance alongside the program she'd spent 2 years developing. She activated the room's projection system, displaying the security footage that had started their crisis. On October 15th, hospital security cameras recorded this interaction between program coordinator Jenna Halley and an individual later identified as Cal Monroe, she said, her voice professionally neutral, despite the personal disappointment Cal could detect beneath her clinical tone. 2 days later, Ms. Halley submitted Mr. Monroe's family for program participation without disclosing their prior contact. The board members studied the grainy footage with the kind of analytical attention that reduced human interaction to potential liability. Cal watched them watching his moment of simple kindness, seeing it transformed from spontaneous compassion into evidence of ethical compromise. "What was the nature of Ms. Halley's explanation for this omission?" asked Dr. Robert Chen, a board member whose questions carried the precision of someone trained in both medicine and law. Ms. Halley acknowledged the violation and stated that she believed disclosure would have eliminated the Monroe family from consideration despite their suitability for program services. Dr. Martinez replied, "And what has been the outcome of the Monroe family's participation?" Dr. Martinez consulted her notes, though Cal suspected she had memorized every detail of their case. "By all measurable standards, the Monroe case has been our most successful example of program effectiveness. Mr. Monroe has achieved stable employment with advancement potential, his son has shown remarkable academic and social improvement, and the family has demonstrated the kind of transformation we hoped the program would facilitate." Cal felt a complex mix of pride and anxiety at hearing their progress described in clinical terms. The statistics Dr. Martinez presented captured the external changes: employment stability, housing security, healthcare access, but couldn't convey the internal transformation that had accompanied their improved circumstances. The return of hope, the restoration of dignity, the simple ability to plan beyond the next crisis. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Hendricks interjected, helped the board understand the significance of this disclosure issue. Why do patient recruitment protocols matter in this context? Patient recruitment protocols exist to ensure that program resources are distributed fairly and that vulnerable populations aren't exploited through personal relationships with healthcare providers. When staff members have undisclosed connections to patients, it creates potential conflicts of interest that can compromise both patient care and program integrity. But in this case, the undisclosed connection preceded the professional relationship, observed Dr. Sarah Kim, the board's youngest member. Mr. Monroe helped Ms. Halley before she knew anything about his family's circumstances or his potential eligibility for the program. That's correct, but the timing doesn't change the ethical obligation to disclose prior relationships that might influence professional judgment. Cal found himself studying the board members' faces, trying to gauge their reactions to the competing concerns of policy compliance and practical outcomes. Some appeared focused on the regulatory implications, while others seemed more interested in the human impact of their decisions. Dr. Martinez, what are your recommendations regarding program continuation? Dr. Hendricks asked. The pilot program has demonstrated significant success in its core mission of addressing social determinants of health through comprehensive family support. The Monroe case, despite the recruitment irregularities, validates our fundamental approach and methodology. She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. However, maintaining program credibility requires strict adherence to ethical protocols. My recommendation is that the program continue with enhanced oversight procedures, but that the Monroe family's participation be terminated due to the circumstances of their recruitment. Cal felt Micah's small hand slip into his, offering comfort that his 8-year-old son shouldn't have needed to provide. The clinical language of terminated participation couldn't disguise the human reality of their family losing the stability that had transformed their lives. "Dr. Martinez," Dr. Chen said, "you mentioned enhanced oversight procedures. What specific changes would you implement?" "Mandatory disclosure forms for all staff interactions with potential program participants. Regular audit procedures for case selection processes, and clear protocols for handling situations where staff members have prior relationships with individuals who might benefit from program services. And these procedures would prevent similar situations in the future. They would create clear documentation trails that would make undisclosed relationships immediately apparent." "Yes." Dr. Hendricks turned her attention to Cal, acknowledging his presence for the first time since the meeting began. "Mr. Monroe, Dr. Martinez indicated that you requested permission to address the board. What would you like us to know about your family's experience with the program?" Cal stood slowly, feeling the weight of institutional attention and the responsibility of speaking not just for his own family, but for the principle that compassion should be valued alongside compliance. Micah remained seated, but handed him the folder of program statistics, a gesture of support that steadied Cal's nerves. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," he began, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who understood the power dynamic at play. 6 months ago, my son and I were facing homelessness despite my best efforts to find stable employment. We were living in a cramped apartment I could barely afford, eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, and wondering how long we could maintain even that level of basic survival. He paused, noting that several board members were listening with the kind of attention that suggested they rarely heard directly from the people affected by their policy decisions. "The night I helped Ms. Halley change her tire, I wasn't thinking about hospital programs or professional opportunities. I was thinking about what my father taught me, that you help people when they need help, regardless of your own circumstances. It didn't occur to me that this simple act would somehow lead to the transformation of my family's entire situation." Cal opened the folder Micah had prepared, revealing pages of data about program outcomes, employment statistics, and cost-effectiveness analyses. "These numbers tell part of our story," he continued, holding up the documents. "Stable employment, housing security, improved health outcomes for both me and my son. But they don't tell you about Micah's art being displayed in the hospital's pediatric wing, or about his confidence returning as he realized he could have friends over to visit, or about the way he stopped having nightmares about us becoming homeless." Dr. Kim leaned forward, her expression suggesting genuine engagement with Cal's testimony. "Mr. Monroe, do you believe Ms. Halley's actions were appropriate?" "I believe Ms. Halley saw a family in crisis and recognized an opportunity to help. Did she follow every protocol perfectly? No, but her decision to help us wasn't about personal benefit or professional advancement. It was about matching resources with need in a way that created positive outcomes for everyone involved. But surely you understand the board's concerns." "About ethical boundaries," Dr. Chen interjected. "I understand that rules exist for important reasons. But I also understand that sometimes strict adherence to rules can prevent the very outcomes the rules were designed to protect. Ms. Halley took a risk to help my family, and that risk resulted in exactly the kind of transformation your pilot program was created to achieve." Cal looked directly at Dr. Hendricks, recognizing that her leadership would likely determine the board's final decision. "You have a choice to make about what matters more, perfect compliance with protocols or recognition that sometimes doing good requires accepting some uncertainty about rules and procedures. I can't tell you what the right choice is for your institution, but I can tell you that Ms. Halley's choice gave my family hope when we had almost given up." The statistics that Micah had helped him compile told the objective story of their transformation. Employment rates, housing stability, healthcare utilization, educational outcomes. But as Cal returned to his seat, he knew that the board's decision would ultimately depend on something that couldn't be quantified: their willingness to value human compassion, alongside institutional integrity. The board's deliberation lasted 47 minutes, during which Cal and Micah waited in the hospital's main lobby, watching staff and visitors navigate the controlled chaos of a major medical center. Micah had brought his sketchbook and was quietly drawing the scene around them. Nurses consulting charts, families gathered in anxious clusters, the constant flow of people seeking healing in its various forms. "Dad, what do you think they're talking about in there?" Micah asked without looking up from his drawing. "They're probably discussing the balance between following rules and helping people," Cal replied, though he suspected the conversation was more complex than his simplified explanation suggested. "Do you think they understand that Ms. Halley was trying to help us?" "I think they understand that. The question is whether they think helping us was worth the risk she took." When they were finally called back to the boardroom, Cal could read nothing definitive in the board members' expressions. Dr. Hendricks waited for them to settle before beginning what Cal recognized would be their final statement on the matter. "Mr. Monroe, thank you for your patience during our deliberation," she said, her tone carrying the formal courtesy of institutional authority. "We've had extensive discussion about the circumstances surrounding your family's participation in the pilot program, and we've reached several conclusions." Cal felt Micah's hand find his again, both of them bracing for news that could send their lives spiraling back toward the instability they'd thought permanently behind them. First, regarding Ms. Halley's conduct, the board finds that she violated established protocols for patient recruitment and failed to disclose a relationship that materially affected her professional judgment. These violations represent serious breaches of ethical standards that cannot be overlooked or excused by positive outcomes. Cal's heart sank as he processed the implications of the board's finding. If Jenna was found culpable for serious ethical violations, her career in healthcare could be permanently damaged, and their family would bear the weight of knowing that helping them had cost her everything. However, Dr. Hendricks continued, the board also recognizes that Ms. Halley's actions, while procedurally improper, were motivated by genuine concern for patient welfare rather than personal gain. Her decision to help your family, though it violated protocols, resulted in exactly the kind of positive outcomes the pilot program was designed to achieve. Cal allowed himself a small measure of hope at the word "however," though he understood that institutional decisions often involved complex compromises that satisfied no one completely. Therefore, the board's decision regarding Ms. Halley is as follows. She will receive a formal reprimand that will become part of her permanent personnel record, and she will be required to complete additional training in professional ethics and boundary management. However, she will not be terminated, and she will be eligible to return to program duties after a 30-day suspension. Relief flooded through Cal's chest, though he recognized that Jenna's professional reputation would carry permanent scars. From their situation, a formal reprimand was serious enough to affect future career opportunities, but it wasn't the complete destruction of her professional life that termination would have represented. Regarding the pilot program itself, Dr. Hendricks continued, the board finds that the family-centered healthcare initiative has demonstrated significant success in achieving its stated goals of addressing social determinants of health through comprehensive family support. The Monroe case, despite the irregularities in recruitment, validates the program's fundamental approach and methodology. "Does that mean the program will continue?" Dr. Kim asked, though Cal suspected she already knew the answer. "The program will not only continue, but will be expanded to serve additional families with enhanced oversight procedures to prevent future ethical complications. Dr. Martinez will implement the protocol modifications she outlined, and all staff will receive additional training in appropriate patient recruitment procedures. Cal felt a surge of gratitude that their crisis hadn't destroyed something that could help other families facing similar struggles. The pilot program's continuation meant that other children like Micah might have access to stability and opportunity, regardless of the circumstances that had brought their situation to light. Finally, regarding the Monroe family's continued participation, Dr. Hendricks said, and Cal felt his breath catch as they approached the decision that would determine their immediate future. The board recognizes that Mr. Monroe and his son bear no responsibility for the procedural violations that brought them to our attention. They have participated in the program in good faith, achieved remarkable success in all measured areas, and represent exactly the kind of family the program was designed to serve. Micah's grip on Cal's hand tightened, both of them suspended between hope and fear as Dr. Hendricks approached her final pronouncement. Therefore, the Monroe family will be permitted to complete their full participation in the pilot program, with the understanding that their case will serve as a template for the kind of comprehensive transformation we hope to achieve with future participants. The relief was so overwhelming that Cal felt momentarily dizzy, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks and could finally exhale. Micah made a small sound that might have been a suppressed cheer, and Cal squeezed his sons, and in acknowledgement of their shared gratitude, "Mr. Monroe," Dr. Hendricks added, "the board was impressed by your testimony today. Your ability to articulate both the practical benefits and the human significance of the program's intervention will be valuable as we seek to expand services to additional families. Would you be willing to serve as a family advocate, helping other participants navigate the program and sharing your experience with potential funding sources?" "I would be honored to help other families in any way I can," Cal replied, though he was still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave the boardroom, Dr. Martinez approached them with an expression that mixed professional relief with personal satisfaction. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "This outcome represents the best possible resolution given the circumstances." "What about Jenna?" Cal asked. "When can we see her?" "Ms. Halley's suspension begins immediately, but she'll be eligible to return to limited duties in 30 days. I suspect she'll be very relieved to know that your family's participation will continue." Walking through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, Cal found himself reflecting on the written decision that had determined their fate. The document represented more than institutional policy. It embodied a recognition that sometimes the most important healing happened in the spaces between rules and regulations, where human compassion could flourish despite bureaucratic constraints. "Dad," Micah said as they reached their car, "do you think Ms. Halley knows what happened yet?" "I hope so, and I hope she knows that we understand what she risked to help us. Can we send her a thank you card?" "I think that would be a very good idea." As they drove home to the apartment that would remain theirs for the duration of the program, Cal allowed himself to fully appreciate the remarkable chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of kindness during a thunderstorm had somehow multiplied into comprehensive transformation of their circumstances, survived a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they'd gained, and emerged stronger for having been tested. The hospital board's written decision lay on the seat between them, official documentation of their right to hope for a stable future. But more important than any document was the recognition that their family had found its place in a community that valued both institutional integrity and human compassion. A community willing to fight for the principle that doing good sometimes required accepting imperfect compliance with perfect rules. 6 months later, the keys to 412 Maple Street felt solid and permanent in Cal's palm as he stood before the modest 2-bedroom house that would be the first home his family had owned in nearly 4 years. The down payment had been possible through The program's Credit Assistance Initiative, his steady employment with Thompson and Associates, had qualified them for a favorable mortgage, and most importantly, they had built the kind of stable foundation that made home ownership sustainable rather than aspirational. It's really ours? Micah asked for the third time that morning, his 8-year-old certainty about the impermanence of good things slowly giving way to cautious acceptance of their transformed circumstances. It's really ours, Cal confirmed, unlocking the front door and stepping aside to let his son enter first. The house was small, but well-maintained, with hardwood floors that caught the afternoon sunlight and windows that opened to let in the sounds of their new neighborhood. More importantly, it was theirs. A place where they could make plans that extended beyond lease renewals and security deposits, where Micah could paint his bedroom walls and Cal could plant a garden that he'd be around to harvest. Micah moved through the space with the careful reverence he'd learned during their years of temporary housing, but Cal could see excitement building behind his son's composed exterior. The larger bedroom would be Micah's, complete with enough wall space to display his ever-growing collection of artwork and a window that looked out over the small backyard where Cal was already planning to build an art studio. "Dad, look at this," Micah called from the kitchen, where he was examining the refrigerator with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned to appreciate functional appliances. "What about it? It's big enough for all our food, and there's space for my drawings, and look," he opened the freezer compartment with obvious delight. "We can buy ice cream and keep it here for more than one day." The simple pleasure in his son's voice reminded Cal of how far they'd traveled, from the careful rationing and day-by-day survival that had defined their previous existence. The abundance they now took for granted, full grocery shopping trips, reliable utilities, the luxury of planning meals rather than making do with whatever was available, represented a transformation that went far beyond mere financial stability. That evening, as they ate dinner at their own kitchen table in their own home, Cal found himself reflecting on the remarkable chain of events that had brought them to this moment. The storm, the flat tire, Jenna's decision to help despite professional risks, the crisis that had nearly destroyed everything, and finally the recognition that sometimes doing good required accepting imperfect compliance with institutional protocols. "Dad, no, there's something I want to show you," Micah said, retrieving his sketchbook from the counter where he'd been organizing his art supplies in preparation for their move. He opened to a page Cal hadn't seen before, a detailed drawing that showed their new house, but populated with figures that made Cal's breath catch. There was Cal himself, working in the garden. Micah sat on the front steps, drawing, and there, helping them carry boxes through the front door, was Jenna, her expression warm with the kind of happiness that comes from seeing good outcomes grow from difficult decisions. "That's beautiful, Micah. But you know Ms. Halley isn't moving in with us, right?" "I know, but she's part of our family now, isn't she? Not like Mom was, but like someone who helped us become who we needed to be." Cal studied his son's artwork, recognizing the emotional truth it captured, even if it didn't reflect their literal living situation. Jenna had indeed become part of their family's story, woven into their narrative of recovery and growth in ways that transcended professional relationships or romantic possibilities. 3 weeks into Jenna's suspension, Cal had been allowed to visit her at her apartment, ostensibly to provide testimony for the program evaluation, but actually to ensure that she understood the outcome of the board hearing and their family's gratitude for the risks she'd taken on their behalf. The conversation had been emotional and complex, touching on professional ethics, personal responsibility, and the unpredictable ways that simple kindness could multiply into life-changing transformation. "I need you to know that I don't regret helping your family," she told him during that visit. "The reprimand, the suspension, the permanent mark on my professional record, none of that changes the fact that you and Micah deserved help and the program was exactly what you needed. I need you to know that we understand what you sacrificed for us." Cal had replied, "and we need you to know that your choice gave us more than stability. It gave us hope that good things could happen to people like us." The relationship that had developed between them over the subsequent months was careful and gradual, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to Micah's well-being rather than the dramatic romance that crisis sometimes created. Jenna had returned to her position as program coordinator with enhanced responsibilities and a reputation for passionate advocacy that actually strengthened rather than damaged her professional standing. Cal had accepted the role of family advocate, helping other participants navigate the program while sharing his experience with hospital administrators and potential funding sources. But more than professional collaboration, they'd discovered a compatibility that went beyond their shared crisis. Jenna understood the weight of single parenthood and the careful balance required to provide stability while allowing room for growth. Cal appreciated her commitment to helping families while maintaining the professional boundaries that protected both caregivers and patients. "Are you going to ask Ms. Halley to marry us?" Micah asked with the directness that characterized his approach to complicated subjects. Cal nearly choked on his coffee. "That's quite a question, buddy. I've been thinking about it. She makes you happy in a different way than Mom did, but still a good way. And she makes me feel safe, like our family is strong enough to handle problems without falling apart. Those are important feelings. And I think she loves us, not just because she's supposed to help us through the program, but because she wants to help us, like how you helped her that night with the tire." Cal considered his son's observation, recognizing the wisdom that seemed to emerge naturally from Micah's combination of artistic sensitivity and hard-earned emotional intelligence. The boy was right about Jenna's feelings, just as he'd been right about most of the complex family dynamics they'd navigated over the past year. "Those are big decisions that adults need to make carefully," Cal said finally. "But you are thinking about it. I'm thinking about a lot of things these days, like how grateful I am that we have a stable home and meaningful work and people in our lives who care about our well-being, and how sometimes the best things happen when you're helping someone else, especially that." Later that evening, as Cal tucked Micah into bed in his own room, in their own house, he found himself overwhelmed by the simple luxury of permanence. Outside, their neighborhood was settling into the quiet rhythms of families with stable homes and predictable routines. Children finishing homework, parents preparing for the next day's work, the ordinary magic of lives built around something more substantial than mere survival. On the kitchen table, partially hidden beneath Micah's latest drawings, lay the business card Jenna had given him that stormy night 6 months ago. He'd kept it as a reminder of the moment when their lives had begun to change, though he could never have predicted the transformation that simple piece of cardboard would eventually represent. Tomorrow, Cal would return to work at Thompson and Associates, where he'd been promoted to senior project manager with responsibilities that matched his experience and potential. Micah would continue at Lincoln Elementary, where his art teacher had nominated him for a statewide youth exhibition that would display his work alongside pieces from across the region. They would grocery shop without calculating every purchase, plan weekend activities without worrying about their cost, and make decisions based on preference rather than desperation. But tonight, in the quiet of their permanent home, Cal Monroe allowed himself to fully appreciate the remarkable truth that had emerged from their journey. Sometimes the universe conspired to reward simple kindness with extraordinary grace, and sometimes the most profound healing came not from following rules perfectly, but from recognizing when compassion required stepping beyond the comfortable boundaries of institutional distance. The storm that had brought them together had long since passed, but the shelter they'd built in its aftermath would weather whatever challenges lay ahead. And in the morning, when Micah's latest drawing found its place on their refrigerator beside homework assignments and grocery lists, it would serve as a daily reminder that home was not just a place, but a choice. The choice to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, that kindness could multiply into transformation, and that families could grow in the spaces between rules and regulations where love was allowed to flourish without conditions or protocols. The keys to their new life lay on the nightstand, catching moonlight from the window, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most important doors were opened not by perfect compliance with institutional requirements, but by the simple human decision to help when help was needed, to hope when hope seemed impossible, and to trust that good outcomes could emerge from imperfect circumstances when guided by genuine compassion for others.